A Mustang, chained and abandoned to his fate in the wilderness, with no one to help him and danger lurking around him. It seemed like his fate was sealed, but what happened next will change everything you thought you knew about survival, courage, and hope. When the world turned its back on him, this horse found a way to fight back against the odds, against the wilderness, and even against the man who abandoned him. Get ready for a story of resilience that will take your breath away. Before we dive in, be sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. In the shadowy forests of Montana, the sun began to set behind the tall pines, casting eerie shadows across the land. Among the cold underbrush lay a Mustang, once a proud and strong creature. Now, he was shaking and weak. His name was Dust, but in that moment, he felt like all hope had been taken from him. Dust had been abandoned by someone he trusted, a farmer who had once cared for him. When Dust fell ill, the farmer decided he could no longer bear the burden of a sick animal. So he chained Dust to a weathered tree deep in the woods and left him there to die. The forest, once a place of freedom and adventure, had become Dust's prison. The chains dug into his skin, and every breath was a struggle. His body ached, not only from the illness, but from the cruel chains that bound him. But Dust wasn't entirely alone. The forest was filled with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional growl of a predator. Exhausted, Dust raised his head one last time, hoping for a miracle. Instead, a grizzly bear appeared. The bear, searching for food, caught Dust's scent. With a low growl, he approached, his muscles rippling beneath his thick fur. Dust was too weak to fight or flee. The bear's hungry eyes locked on him, ready to strike. But then something unexpected happened. The stillness of the forest was broken when a voice rang out. "Hey, get away from him." A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a small but fierce woman. Her name was Clara, and she had known Dust for years. Clara had worked on the farmer's land, tending to the horses. When she heard rumors of Dust's disappearance, she sensed something was wrong and decided to find him. Clara screamed again, raising her arms to make herself look larger and more intimidating. The bear hesitated, its instincts warning it to retreat. After a tense moment, the bear growled but backed away into the trees. Clara ran to Dust's side. Her hands shook as she worked to free him from the chains. Dust barely moved, too weak to respond. Finally, she let go and whispered, "You're safe now. I won't leave you." Dust, though frail, gently stroked her hand. Clara's heart ached for him. She knew he was on the brink of survival and that time was running out. With years of experience working with animals, Clara sprang into action. She gently cupped Dust's face. "I have you now," she whispered. Her voice, though gentle, was filled with strength and reassurance. Dust, even in his weakened state, seemed to understand. But freeing Dust was just the beginning. Clara had to take him to a veterinary clinic miles away. The journey through the forest was exhausting. Clara tied a rope around Dust's neck and coaxed him forward. Every step he took was shaky and painful. The forest, once peaceful, now felt dangerous and cruel. The path was rough, the wind howled, and darkness crept in as the sky turned gray. Hours passed. Dust stumbled again, his legs giving way beneath him. Clara crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're strong," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "We can do this." The forest was silent now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Dust snorted softly and lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting Clara's. It was a small gesture, but it lit a spark of hope in her heart. Clara kept going, her muscles screaming for rest. Dust needed her. And just when she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw a light between the trees. A small cabin stood in the distance. It was a beacon of hope. The veterinary clinic was nearby. Clara's legs burned with exhaustion, but she kept moving. The cabin drew closer, its warm light flickering like a promise. Finally, they reached the cabin. The door opened and a tall, gray-haired man stepped out. His eyes immediately locked on Dust. "Is he okay?" the man asked, his voice urgent. "He's barely holding on," Clara replied, her voice shaking. Please help us." Without hesitation, the man stepped aside, letting Clara lead Dust inside. The smell of hay and antiseptic filled the air. Dust's struggle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. In the center of the room was a table with tools neatly laid out nearby. The man, who Clara now realized was a veterinarian, wasted no time. He got to work immediately, moving his hands with calm precision as he examined Dust. Clara stepped back, her heart pounding, fighting to push away the panic that threatened to take hold of her. She had done everything she could to bring Dust here, but now it was out of her hands. The veterinarian worked silently, occasionally muttering to himself. For Clara, moments stretched into what seemed like hours. Her eyes remained fixed on Dust, whose shallow, uneven breaths filled the room. She whispered his name softly, hoping he could hear her. "Cheer up, Dust. You'll make it." Finally, the vet stepped back, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. His expression was serious, but not hopeless. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated," the vet said, his voice calm and firm. "But the good news is that there's no major organ damage. With proper care, he can recover." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaking with hope. The vet nodded. "It won't be easy, but he's strong. He fought hard to get here. I think he has the will to live." Relief washed over Clara like a wave crashing to the ground. For the first time since she found Dust chained in the woods, she allowed herself to breathe. She looked at him, her eyes half open now, and felt a bond stronger than words could express. For the next few days, Clara stayed by Dust's side, nursing him back to health. The clinic became his refuge, a sanctuary from the pain and fear Dust had endured. Clara was there for every meal, every small step of progress, and every little sign of hope. She spoke to him softly, always encouraging him. "You are not alone anymore," she whispered. "You are safe now." Slowly, Dust began to regain his strength. His once shaky legs became steadier. His dull, lifeless eyes began to shine again, filled with a spark of life. Watching him heal filled Clara's heart with pride. Their bond deepened with each passing day. But Clara knew the hardest part was yet to come. Dust's physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars of being abandoned would take much longer. Trust, once broken, could not be repaired overnight. One night, as Clara sat next to Dust in the meadow behind the clinic, she noticed something different. He stood a little straighter, a little more confident. For the first time, he took a few firm steps on his own. "You're doing it, Dust," Clara whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "You're going to be okay." Dust turned his head to her, his dark eyes soft and full of trust. For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. The bond between them had grown beyond survival. It was now a promise of a new beginning. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Clara knew their journey together had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and Dust continued to grow stronger. Clara woke up early each morning to care for him. The clinic became more than just a place of healing. It became her home. She spent her days watching Dust rediscover his strength and, more importantly, his trust in people. But challenges lay ahead. Clara hoped to find a sanctuary where Dust could live in peace, free from the cruelty of his past. However, every rescue center she contacted was full. The realization hit Clara hard. The world wasn't ready to make room for Dust, and that left her with a choice. She could return to her old life in the city, leaving Dust behind, or she could stay and fight for him, for a future where he wasn't just another sad story of neglect and abandonment. One quiet afternoon, as Clara sat on the edge of Dust's stall, watching him graze in the fading light, the answer became clear. There was no choice. She couldn't leave him, not after everything they'd been through. She'd promised Dust when she rescued him that he'd never be alone again, and she intended to keep that promise. The thought of taking Dust home was overwhelming. She didn't know how she'd manage or where she'd put him, but she knew one thing. They were in this together. Clara looked at Dust, who stood his ground. Under the twilight sky. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. Dust turned to her, his eyes full of confidence, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, The future didn't seem so uncertain after all. I'm not going anywhere, Dust, Clara whispered, running her hand through his mane. We'll figure this out together. As she stood up and brushed the dust off her jeans, the sound of an approaching truck caught her attention. Turning toward the door, she saw Jackson, the vet, stepping out of his truck. He was carrying a box of supplies and had a worried look on his face. I've been thinking about you too, Jackson said, coming closer. I know you're trying to figure things out. There's a place, a sanctuary, a few hours from here. It's not fancy, but they specialize in horses like Dust. Clara's heart skipped a beat. That was the answer she'd been waiting for. Are you sure? She asked, her voice heavy with emotion. Will he be okay there? Jackson nodded, a gentle smile softening his expression. They have the experience and I think it will be good for him. He'll have other horses around, and they'll take proper care of him. Relief washed over Clara like a warm tide. She'd wanted to keep Dust with her, but deep down, she knew he needed more than she could provide. This was his best chance at a new life. Thank you, Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Thank you for helping him. Jackson rested a hand on her shoulder. It's what we do. Dust is a survivor, Clara, and so are you. The next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, bathing the fields in golden light. Clara prepared Dust for the journey ahead. His once frail body now had a quiet strength, his coat shiny and healthy. As he was loaded into the trailer, Clara fought back tears. Her heart ached knowing it was goodbye, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. Dust needed this new beginning. As the trailer door closed and the truck pulled away, Clara stood in the doorway, watching until it was gone. Her heart felt heavy, but also full. Dust was headed toward a life full of hope, freedom, and the love he had always deserved. Months passed, but Dust never left Clara's heart. He visited the sanctuary often, and each visit brought her a mix of joy and sadness. Dust had transformed. His fur was shiny, his muscles were strong, and his steps were sure. But there was something in his eyes, a trace of the pain he had once endured. It reminded Clara that some wounds, even when healed, leave scars. One afternoon, Clara's phone rang. It was Jackson. Clara, you need to come to the sanctuary, he said, his voice tight. It's Dust. Something's wrong. Clara's chest tightened. What happened? Is he hurt? No, Jackson replied. He's not physically sick. He's just shut down. He's not eating and he's withdrawn. We've been monitoring him, but he's not responding like he should. Clara didn't hesitate. She dropped everything and headed straight to the sanctuary. Her mind was filled with worry. Dust had been through so much. How could he be going through hard times again? When Clara arrived, she found Dust lying under the shade of an oak tree. His bright eyes, once full of life, were now dull and distant. He barely lifted his head as she knelt beside him. Hey, buddy, she whispered in a shaky voice. What's wrong? Talk to me. You've been through so much. You can't give up now. Jackson stepped closer, his face shadowed with worry. We've examined him, he said. There are no signs of illness or pain. This seems emotional. He's withdrawn, like he's shutting down. Clara sat down next to Dust and stroked his mane gently. Her heart ached for him. Dust had been thriving. Why was he pulling away? And then she realized. It wasn't his body that needed healing anymore. It was his heart. Dust had been abandoned, left to die in a place where he should have felt free. Though he had learned to trust Clara, the shadows of his past hadn't quite dissipated. He had been saved, but deep down, he still felt alone. Trauma wasn't something Dust just carried. It had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his being. As Clara watched him lay in the shade, she realized something important. Dust wasn't just healing physically. He needed time, patience, and love to heal his heart. That day, Clara stayed by his side for hours. She spoke softly to him, brushing his fur and whispering promises. You're safe now, she said. No one will ever hurt you again. I'll be here, always. As the sun set on the horizon, something changed. Dust's breathing steadied, his ears perked up, and then he quietly, cautiously, stroked Phil's hand. All right. It was the smallest gesture, but to Clara, It was the strongest statement of trust. From afar, Jackson watched, his face softened by understanding. "He just needs time," he said quietly. "He's not giving up, Clara. He's just been through more than most can imagine." Clara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Dust had already fought many battles, his pain, his past, and his fears. She realized then that he wasn't just surviving. He was recovering. The next morning, Clara made a decision. She would stay at the sanctuary for as long as Dust needed her. She visited him every day, sat with him, talked to him, and gave him the strength to keep going. It wasn't just about Dust recovering anymore. It was about healing together. Weeks turned into months, and Dust began to blossom. His spark returned, his eyes shining with joy. He ran through the pasture with the other horses, his hooves pounding the dirt in a rhythm that spoke of freedom and resilience. Clara often stood at the edge of the field, watching him. His spirit was indomitable and unbreakable, and watching him thrive filled her with pride. One evening, as the sun was setting, she whispered to the wind, "You did it, Dust. You found your freedom." Dust's recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. His fur was shining, his muscles were tensed with strength, and his confidence grew every day. But Clara could not shake the feeling that her story was not over. There was still something unresolved, a chapter unfinished. One morning, as she prepared to leave the sanctuary, Jackson took her aside. His expression was serious. "Clara," he began, "we've received a call. A man claims to be Dust's original owner. He's asking for him back." Clara's stomach turned. She hadn't expected this. The idea of Dust being returned to the person who had abandoned him was unthinkable. "What does he want with Dust?" Clara asked, her voice tight with anger. Jackson hesitated. "He says he wants to fix things. But from what I've discovered, he's not someone we can trust." Clara's heart raced. She couldn't let this man take Dust, not after everything he'd been through. Determination rose in her chest. "I'll go with you to meet him," Clara said firmly. "If he really wants to fix things, he needs to understand what Dust's been through. But I'm not going to let him take him without a fight." Clara and Jackson drove to the address the man had given them. The area was remote, far from the sanctuary and safe haven Dust now called home. When they pulled up in front of a ramshackle barn, Clara's uneasiness grew. The place radiated abandonment, and she felt a deep sense of foreboding. A man in his mid-40s stood outside smoking a cigarette. His face was rough, his eyes cold, and his posture suggested he wasn't used to being challenged. "You must be Clara," the man said gruffly. "I'm Tom, Dust's rightful owner." Clara felt her breath catch, anger simmering just beneath the surface. But she kept her voice steady. "I'm Clara," she said firmly. "I've been taking care of Dust for months, and I'll tell you this. He's not going anywhere." Tom's eyes narrowed as he tossed his cigarette to the ground. "You don't get to decide what happens to him. He's mine, and I'm taking him back." Clara didn't flinch. Her voice was firm, her gaze unyielding. "You don't understand, do you? Dust isn't just yours. He's a living being who's been through hell, and I'm not going to let you take him back to that." Tom stepped closer, his face hardening. "You think I don't know what happened to him? I had my reasons for leaving him there. He wasn't good enough for the ranch. He wasn't what I needed." Clara's blood boiled, but she didn't back down. "That's not an excuse. Dust has suffered enough because of your decisions. He doesn't deserve to go back to someone who abandoned him." For a long moment, silence hung between them, thick with tension. Clara's heart raced, but she held firm, refusing to let Tom bully her. He'd fought too hard for Dust to let him go without a fight. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tom stepped back. His expression softened, and for the first time, Clara saw something unexpected in his eyes, a flash of regret. "You're right," he said, his voice calmer now. "I was wrong. I wasn't ready for him. I don't deserve to have him." Clara blinked, stunned for a moment. She'd prepared herself for a battle, but not for this. A man acknowledging his mistakes. "I never thought I'd survive," Tom admitted, almost to himself. "Not after what happened. But if he's better off with you, then maybe it's for the best." Relief washed over Clara like a wave. She'd been ready to fight for Dust with everything she had. But now she didn't have to. I'll take full responsibility for Dust from now on, Clara said firmly. He's in good hands and he's not going anywhere. Tom nodded slowly, as if the decision had already been made. I don't deserve him, he muttered. Maybe it's better this way. Without another word, Clara turned and walked back to the truck, Jackson at her side. As they drove away from the ruined barn, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Dust was safe. For the first time in a long time, Clara truly believed everything was going to be okay. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of emotions. Clara couldn't get out of her mind how close she'd come to losing Dust, but knowing he was safe, away from the clutches of someone who didn't understand or deserve him, brought her a deep sense of peace. Dust's recovery continued to surprise everyone. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his once cautious steps were now bold and confident. He no longer flinched at sudden noises or movements. Instead, he moved with the strength and grace of a Mustang who had rediscovered his spirit. But it wasn't just Dust who had changed. Clara had changed, too. Caring for Dust had given her a purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. She no longer felt like she simply existed. Now, she lived each day with intention and gratitude for the horse who had entered her life when she needed him most. One sunny afternoon, Clara stood by the fence, watching Dust gallop across the field. His mane waved like a banner of freedom, and his hooves pounded the dirt in a steady rhythm. Jackson walked over, a warm smile on his face. You've done something. Something amazing happened with him, she said, her voice full of admiration. Clara kept her gaze on Dust, her voice soft but firm. No, she replied. He did it. He healed himself. I just gave him the space to trust again. Jackson nodded. Sometimes that's all a horse needs. Someone to believe in them when no one else will. Clara turned to him, her gaze filled with emotion. I never thought I'd be the one to make a difference. I thought I was just a caretaker. But it's more than that. We saved each other. Jackson's smile deepened, the corners of his eyes crinkling. You did. And now look at him. He's a whole new horse. Clara's chest tightened with emotion. She could see it clearly. The Mustang's spirit was no longer buried under layers of fear and pain. Dust had found his strength, and so had she. As the sun began to set, tinting the field in a glow golden, Clara whispered to the wind, You did it, Dust. You found your freedom. Clara walked over to where Dust stood, his silhouette framed by the fading light of day. She reached out, her fingers brushing his soft muzzle. He nuzzled her gently, his eyes brimming with trust, and for the first time, Clara realized that this wasn't just about saving a horse, this was about their shared journey of healing and redemption. Dust had found freedom, but so had she. The bond they shared was beyond words, a silent understanding, a mutual respect for the paths they traveled, paths filled with struggle and pain, but paths that had ultimately led them to each other. Thank you, Clara whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. Gratitude filled her heart as she rested her forehead against his. You showed me what true strength is. Dust snorted softly in response, his warm breath brushing against her skin. At that moment, Clara knew that no matter what the future held, they would always have each other. They were a team, united by something much bigger than the world had ever tried to take from them. As the last light of day faded into the twilight, Clara made a silent promise to Dust. A promise that no one would ever hurt him again, that they would never abandon him. They were free, and together they would face whatever came their way. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or ask any questions you have about Dust's journey. Your voice matters. Together, we can build a community of hope, healing, and connection. If this story touched your heart, join us and be a part of something bigger. Remember, you're not just subscribing to a channel, you're becoming a part of a story that reminds us all of the incredible power of love and second chances. Thank you for being here.